Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about lyrical narratives, some fun with them, the concept itself, just some discussion. EyePatchNotes begins of gushing about a song/group that I like as a loose continuation of lyrical narrative as a concept, which we'll explain during this Parley. In the non-indicatively named Stronghold Land Eater, the first song we're going to talk about, it's from a game soundtrack. I can't play any of the songs, but they're in the description if you want to listen to them. Listen to a little bit of them. You can hear the thing we're going to talk about very quick. You know, you listening for 10 seconds would be enough. It's almost like that should be fair use, but anyway. We're greeted with a warlike drumline and the following arc words. I fight again, heal but I run in circles. And you can see we have a little circle of the graphics here that we'll be using for reference. So we're starting up here. The kind of main refrain of the song, and it's quite in the background, you know, almost like an instrumental or an atmospheric piece of lyrical narrative, not exactly vocals. Obviously it is technically vocals, but they're really in the background, evolves over the course of the times that it's kind of rerun. And the instruments also do something kind of like that. The first phase of the track is broken into 4 escalating stanzas. The first one with foreground vocals, drums, and background synth. The second one with foreground choir, drums, and background vocals and background synth. The third one with foreground synth and drums with background choir. And the fourth one with foreground choir, foreground synth, and drums. It's almost like they're rotating. At the climax of the second phase, we have uncontested vocals filling in the blanks that we saw before. I fight again, they say time can heal, but I run in circles. As you can see, they're adding little things that spins around. Now wait, back in the first phrase's second stanza, there was yet another iteration. I don't want to fight again, heal but I run in circles. They snuck in lyrical narrative in the background vocals, subtle but it is there. And putting it all together, it can be said that the fully qualified arc words are, I don't want to fight again. They say time can heal, but I run in circles. EyePatchNotes concludes this section. If Parley submission was a uni course, I would have yellow flags all over my rap sheet for last-minute submissions of varying quality. The graphic is among my worst, but I wanted something. I disagree. I think this is perfectly serviceable. Certainly for the amount of time spent versus the amount of utility gained, I feel like this is nice. And as my own creative rap sheet, if my career were a university course, and isn't it in a way, I as a creator am often a little shy to make something I don't think is just really good. Even though my own value system, I would tell you that I think if something isn't that great but is very valuable for the amount of time put in, that's awesome. You know what I mean? Like, I admire that kind of thing in other people's work. So good on you as far as I'm concerned. And the point is, you can see how for something that is kind of just one of the instruments in the song, the vocals don't take center stage, it's just like another feature of the song, they chose to have a very simple message or like lyrical idea progress in a way that helps represent what is being talked about, rather than focusing on it being particularly obtuse. You know what I mean? Like, I wonder what it's about. Like, you know abundantly clearly what the song is trying to say, but it's structured in a way that gives it a feeling of these things looping in on each other a little. The idea of the instruments kind of passing around to each other is pretty cool too. I think that's neat. EyePatchNotes continues, Pants are a suggestion. Nike, goddess of victory, was a short-lived flame that I am sorely disappointed to have anti-consumer practices. Nonetheless, I cherry-picked a video for optional viewing, and I actually saved this for during the Parley because I haven't really seen any gameplay of this game. And so it looks like it's going to be the boss fight that this song is from. Aha, okay, I see. Yeah, you can see some rather pretty, I thought, background art of this boss in the music video for Stronghold Land Eater. Music video, the video with the music, lyric video, I suppose. And now I can see in gameplay that the, what are they called in this game? Nikes, you know, the gacha characters are fighting against that boss while like different parts of it pop off and attack and stuff. Pretty interesting. What an odd, anyway. One of said anti-consumer practices in Nike is the reliance on gear score. I believe this is not a foreign concept to our captain. Nope, I'm familiar. But it's one number that dictates the player's performance. This is often in spite of the player's designed synergies. The player has to make the number go up to play the game. As a result, missions in Nikke have an explicit time limit. No pillow fighting, no slow victories. The player must score a decisive victory within 3 minutes. Now, what does this have to do with music, you might ask? Well, one interesting consequence of that is that the developer can time the music such that a crescendo occurs during a phase transition. This is exactly what happens in Stronghold Land Eater when the track goes from drum and synth to full wub wub. Indeed, I was wondering, there was kind of a shift, and when I watched the lyric video or the music video, I thought, phase change, phase 2, right? Obviously, I've played a video game before. Pretty cool. Undertale does something very similar in the fight against, I guess, a spoiler. Yeah, this one is like, I haven't played Undertale and I still knew this happened. So I guess a minor spoiler for Undertale, skip 10 seconds ahead if you don't want it. In the fight against Sans, does this even need a spoiler tag in 2024? It's still considerate to do. The entire fight is choreographed to the soundtrack and takes a specific amount of time. Yes, it's interesting to see how that tied in together. At first I thought, you know, I actually kind of want to hear what your limited experience with this strange game that I've only vaguely heard of before. I kind of wanted to hear what you thought of the game's design, but as you wrote this part, EyePatchNotes, on my first read through, I thought, what are you doing here? Why are we doing? I thought we were doing music. No, it's totally related. Yes, there's an interesting way in which the kind of determinism of the fight means it's easier to match up music in certain ways. Pretty interesting. The idea that the music in video games can match what the player is doing in a special way is a really interesting kind of additional challenge, but for a potential additional reward. It can be more difficult to find a gameplay loop where the player's actions can be matched to the music, to find a way to sync up what's happening in gameplay with music. But if you do, it feels like the player has a soundtrack to their life. It's awesome. You know, that's incredible when it works well. Super, super cool. There's lots of different approaches to these kind of layered or circular or, you know, transforming tracks in lots of games. One that I recently experienced that I really liked was Nier Automata, where each track has been broken into quite a few, 4 or 5, it seems, different variations that are like each only part of the piece. So like just its strings or just its woodwinds or just its vocals or, you know, whatever. And then also an 8-bit or like a chiptune version for when you do hacking in the middle of combat, which sounds a little gimmicky or like, why would you bother doing that? But 9S in Nier Automata can be melee fighting stuff and then hack into a heavier enemy often you'll do it for. And the music will completely seamlessly transition into an 8-bit version of itself for the 10 seconds you're doing your hacking minigame, right in the middle of combat, and then completely seamlessly transition back. And it's so, ooh, that got me every time. It's so cool. Very, very smooth. It made it feel so much more incorporated into combat as well. You don't stop the flow in the same way. The hacking minigame is a weird part of Nier Automata in a way when used in combat, because it does mean everything kind of comes to a stop for a second, but the music keeps going and kind of adapts to it. Ooh, that's a big move. That really did a lot, I thought, to keep it connected to the action and not to kind of crash the intensity of the combat just because you did something that was, you know, different or a change up. Very, very cool idea. And so the idea that you could use music in any number of ways to indicate something as simple as a phase transition, but also to kind of tell a sort of circular narrative. The other thing I wanted to get into was how music, when you're playing a game, may be suited by leaning further into a certain kind of lyrics. We talked, or I quipped really a little bit earlier about how these lyrics are not very, they're quite straightforward, you know, and I think that that's very good. I have some opinions about just like lyrics and music in general, let alone in this case, that I'm going to espouse to you now. But it's very related to gaming, I promise you. I like that the way of using lyrics where the kind of difficulties inherent in interpreting lyrics are worked through with structure, with music. And the lyrics themselves are lyrics, not poetry that you read all by itself and you have it on the page and you can clearly work through any weirdnesses in the stanzas. No, a part of a song that is a piece of music. I hate to be snarky. I just feel like most, quote, deep lyrics are a really bad user experience, and people just have kind of a fetish, or their values are kind of broken when something is sort of hard to understand, worried that they will say, if they say something like, oh, I don't get it, you know, I don't understand the song, worried that they'll be told they're just stupid or ignorant for it. I think people have a tendency to just knee-jerk, like blanket declare something is deep, basically, if they don't get it. And I think this is very silly, of course. You know, it can be really interesting to write deeply layered, you know, poetic prose, for example, or even lyrics. But I think that in the context of most music, the way you experience that part of the song, because it's a song, because they're lyrics, makes it very difficult to penetrate the meaning of the thing being said, and thus what exactly is the point of that thing. Now, I don't think that there's absolutely nothing to it. There are points where, for no reason at all recently, I was listening to Taylor Swift, who recently released a new big chungo album. It's real long. Maybe it counts as 2 albums. I don't know how that works. It's a lot of songs, okay? It's very, very long. I didn't listen to the whole thing. But I listened to some of it, and I listened to some of it because a close friend really enjoyed it, and I wanted to engage with it. And it can be pretty fun to sort of go over to a piece of media considered very good by a lot of people that I don't spend a huge amount of time talking to, and see in what way, you know, from my perspective, it is good or that I can enjoy it, right? And it did something that I'm thankful I've gotten to leave behind for the most part, which is it's absolutely silly with references to things, presumably from her life, I would imagine. And it seems like the fan base or the audience is, at least some of them, are pretty high on that kind of stuff, because it's like a little Easter egg or like a little scavenger hunt. I think there's something strange and maybe effective going on there where, yeah, well, because there is an intended way of enjoying and experiencing the music that is not just listening to it. And so that stuff kind of makes sense in a way. It becomes like a weird augmented reality game almost. But even then, I feel like the lyrics are not unclear. They're just unhelpfully specific if you're not like a nerd about Taylor Swift's life. You know what I mean? That they're still pretty direct. They're overly caught up on specific life details of a person that you have nothing to do with, you know. That being as it may, I just thought it was interesting to note this idea that making the lyrics even simpler, not just not making them overly poetic when it will be hard to interpret them that way in a song, but to make them actually aggressively simple, to make them even more straightforward than normal, and to make the way that the song creates meaning through its musical structure, through its stanzas, through its progressions, through riffs on themes and leitmotifs in the music. And it's interesting, EyePatchNotes and Pistol Whip, you've had a parlay like this. Your parlay about music and the lyrics and storytelling of music have often evoked this kind of thing, have often been focused on this way of music creating meaning. I think it's interesting. Additionally, the sometimes repetitive nature of a lot of songs like this suits games very well for a couple of reasons. One obvious one is that if it isn't something like this Nikke situation where, you know, the fight has kind of a set time and therefore you can predict phase transitions or whatever, you can have a piece of music repeat its verse and chorus, you know, more times as needed. A very simple reason. But more than that, it also means that the audience gets a chance to hear these motifs in the lyrics repeated multiple times. They get to read multiple times. I think when people read prose or poetry and are trying to, you know, penetrate it and get a certain meaning out of it, find what's between the lines, I think people often undersell how often we read things twice. You do not read a thing one time. It is shockingly more difficult. Maybe it shouldn't be. It's not to me. Maybe it isn't to you. but it is shockingly more difficult than I think some people give it credit for to interpret something that you hear spoken one time. I've even noticed, because I often talk about things that are really, really more complicated than I am fully prepared to be able to explain in one pass. I've been trying to teach myself to be free to just try to explain it another way, or, don't worry if it repeats itself. Don't worry if, the audience is going to hear me explaining the same thing, like 2 or 3 times on a stream, for example. I just don't think, as it's not a bug, but a feature, like we kind of need to do that anyway a lot of the time. And it's going to help me figure out what I think about it better. By the same token, I think creating meaning with music in video games, there is a lot going on. There's the gameplay and everything else about the game design, and also a piece of music with many layers and possibly not immediately penetrable lyrics. If you want the audience to experience anything from that piece of music, you need to do something to help them kind of get in there. And I think repetition, using the musical structure as a way to make the piece of music feel a way that it is meant to be about, rather than just saying what it's about, and then also saying what it's going to be about in a more blunt way. You get the idea. Can all help to create a piece of music that really sticks in your head when you think about playing that game. Obviously, there are subtle things in soundtracks, like just the mood, the vibe, the mode that the piece of music is in. Of course, obviously, but sticking just to lyrics, I think that the way you can kind of synchronize them and create meaning, like in this example you've given us, EyePatchNotes, is really important to create good video game music. And more broadly, I kind of feel like a lot of music in general could learn from this kind of stuff. I really enjoy a type of music that is sometimes referred to as through composed music, music where there isn't as much of a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus repeating structure, and the music, to some greater extent than normal, or 100% completely, doesn't repeat itself, and it kind of fully progresses for its entire duration. Some examples of music that I've really enjoyed that does this, if you want to listen to some of it, it's maybe a little weird, but if you want it, a couple songs that come to mind are Growing Old is Getting Old by Silver Sun Pickups, and what's that Dream Theater song called? The Count of Tuscany. This one isn't, neither of them are fully through composed, but they're all kind of stories to one extent or another. The Count of Tuscany is more of a story, as is very Dream Theater. The Silver Sun Pickups song, Growing Old is Getting Old, is more of a normal song, but just that instead of having a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus structure, is instead more through composed. So an example of each of the two, if you like. I have a very weird way I organize my music. For my music that is in English, I have 7 playlists named after the 7 deadly sins, and the through composed stuff goes in the greed playlist. That is my personal affectation of where I think it fits, and I love it so. That is one of my favorite ones. Right up there with envy, which is like theatrical or not bombastic music, but like dramatic in a way beyond normal music. A better way to say it is kind of halfway house between almost musical theater and normal music. I've found a decent amount of songs like this that I really like, even though I don't much like musical theater. I think there's some drama to these pieces of music that can be fun. If you want some examples, Champion of Light by Old Gods of Asgard, which is from Alan Wake 2, would be an example. Dance Dance by Fall Out Boy is an example. Anyway, this is not about that, but since I brought it up, I know some people are going to be like, what are the 7 playlists? Like, there's not much to say. I wonder what the Wrath one is going to be like. You know what I mean? Come on, use your imagination. But some of the weirder ones I thought I would tell you. Okay, enough of a sidetrack. Catching back up. EyePatchNotes continues. While I have no nostalgia or love for Nikke, I do nonetheless check in every now and then, and it turns out that Cosmograph, the artist for Stronghold Land Eater, the song we talked about in part 1, actually worked on the soundtrack for my game of the year, Chrono Arc. The mandatory first boss, all players will have this experience out of the boss, has the captivating and charming track Hope for Existence. What a banger. Besides really putting the rave in the graveyard, am I right? Ooh, big line and absolutely true. This song is a heckin' bop. You go in the description. Stop, I'm serious. Pause this right now and go listen to that song. It's great. The rave in the graveyard. Oh, baby. Very nice. Hold me back. Lyrical narrative is something I deeply love Chrono Arc for. This is despite the fact that Chrono Arc primarily uses instrumentals in its soundtrack. Subtly different but complementary instruments can be used in lieu of true vocals, as is the case with Hope for Existence. Here we start with some nice violin, before hitting the dance floor. This can effectively be called the chorus, as the same notes in the same order come up a few times. We then pick up some piano that highlights the string while not exactly matching it. The biggest flourish for me is the second verse/bridge, where the uns melts away and we return to just the violin. Moving into some more piano and choice guitar, the uns elements are brought back slowly before coming to their own crescendo. Even without words at all, a story is being told by which instruments are being played and when. I do not have anything resembling self-taught or formal training in music theory, but I do have confidence in my pattern-seeking lizard brain. For the songs I keep in my lists, I've thoroughly thought about why I like them as much as I do. And part of the answer is what I refer to as emotional listening. I prefer anime and game soundtracks because of how I felt when experiencing them. Stronghold Land Eater does not fall under this category for me because I spurned and burned Nikke before reaching this boss in actual play. However, I do thoroughly enjoy Chrono Arc soundtrack enough to seek it on the tube of views. Combined with my habit of preferring first-party listing of tracks, the algorithm happened to bring up Cosmograph's other offerings, and I will gravitate to robots in thumbnails. Despite spending no real time in the Nikke sphere, I nonetheless found pieces of their soundtrack in my library by perfect storm of coincidence. I attribute this to thinking why I like the music I like, and that usually boils down to lyrical narrative in illusion or truth. Yeah, I agree. I said that I manage my English lyric music in those 7 Deadly Sins playlists. I manage the non-English, mostly Japanese lyric music differently. It doesn't bear mentioning here. But most of it is like openings or endings from anime I liked, or from games I played, or what have you. And I think you're absolutely right that the kind of mood evoked by the track is significantly coming from my memory of the show it was from. I think a lot of these pieces of music, if you don't watch a lot of anime, I think something very unique to a lot of these anime openings is that they are unbelievably well matched with the piece of media that they're on top of. The opening for My Hero Academia Season 1. Oh my goodness, like it's like a microcosm of the whole show. I just feel like they did such a specific job matching the vibe of that season. You could almost listen through the openings for something like My Hero Academia for its 7 or whatever seasons and feel the story changing as you went, although there were some toward the back half I didn't like as much. But for the first 3 or 4 seasons, I feel like the opening says so much about where we are in the story. I can feel the mood that is that season of the anime just from the opening. They did a really specific job matching those things. Or another one that really sticks out to me is Fire Force's openings and endings. Specifically, I think the first ending, we see the backstory for one of the characters. This is a pretty cool part of the show. So they're a fire department that stops kind of not normal fires, but instead fires created by these sort of fire zombies. I'm massively oversimplifying because it's not important to the parlay. If you've watched Fire Force, yes, I know they're not, but just leave me alone. Like, let me do this. And we create a little fire squad. Each of them has a sister that prays for the deceased, who are the fire zombies that are going to be put to rest. There are people who have their own fire manipulating abilities, and we have to get this whole squad together. Now, it's a decent-sized group of people. This show has a lot of characters, and so one of the things they did was put some of the storytelling or backstory for a few of the characters where we don't need to know exactly what happened, but it would be useful to know where they are coming from in general, into openings and endings. Particularly the sister and Arthur come to mind. Their backstories are I don't mean to be rude. I like these characters quite a lot, actually. But it's just not that important for us to know the exact specifics of their backstories. We see the sister's backstory, and I believe the first ending, and the song. You can feel her, Abby burning down and her running away from the infernals that come out of it. The song feels like I can never get that image out of my head. The song really feels like the character running away. But here's my thing. Chicken or the egg? I mean, does it? Or is it just because that's the first time I saw it? You see what I mean? And it's for this reason that I nearly universally always put the openings and ending songs that I like onto my phone or whatever, music listening thing, in their full form. Usually, if you're not familiar, it's going to be their verse and chorus, just one verse and just one chorus. And it's very, very common that it's kind of a supercut of the song, that they include some elements of often like the very, very end of the song, but it's mostly the first verse and chorus, or like some combination thereof. It's not exactly the same, but it's very significantly similar to the song. Much more similar than something like a radio edit, but a slight reorganization of the pieces of the song. Thus, it's pretty interesting to hear the full version of the song with mostly the part you remember, but additional parts as well, and to kind of feel out what that adds to the experience, I guess. In many cases, it's really congruent. In other cases, it kind of adds a new feeling or dimension to the experience. That My Hero Academia opening that I mentioned before has a killer guitar solo that it absolutely doesn't show up anywhere in the anime or at the anime opening. But that really fits the vibe of the show, the kind of frantic, but still relatively positive, we're going to get through it with guts kind of attitude that the show has in its combat sequences is very well captured by that guitar solo. You can feel like the people who picked this song listened to the whole thing and went, no notes, like put in whatever you want. Every single second of this song's audio waveform is a perfect encapsulation of this show. It's just amazing. I think that's really well done. It's interesting because my understanding is that in Japanese music culture, media industry, this is a way that a lot of artists get their start. Like, it's a pretty big deal as far as promo goes. And you would think that that would mean that a lot of the time the music would be kind of a gimme, not particularly an incredible fit for the piece of media. After all, it's a financial instrument, is it not? And I suppose you might say that statistically that's true, but I just haven't watched those shows, and the good shows that I've watched, and there are quite a lot of them, my word, they didn't leave anything on the table. Like, if they're doing that for marketing, man, I'm sold. Great job. You're not selling out at all. It's just been very impressive in my mind. Anyway, yeah, I like the idea to go a little bit more back. I do have stuff to say about this Chrono Arc track, the Rave in the Graveyard. I'm really enjoying that line you wrote. Hope for Existence, the Chrono Arc song. I have a note that I wanted to get into a little bit about syncopating the pieces of music. Okay, so not only was I quite into my whole thesis for this parlay has been keeping the music non-overwhelming when it's going to be happening alongside like other things in gameplay, and there's going to be a lot to unpack about just what you're seeing in gameplay, let alone the lyrics if there are any. Something I thought was kind of interesting that this Chrono Arc track did was it sort of syncopates different instruments such that the violin, when it comes back, will be interspersed with the bass beat. So the song doesn't really gain more things for you to mentally keep track of. It kind of keeps mental load down, and yet it does kind of pick up its intensity. Syncopation being the thing where you take the beats that the bass in this case is hitting and insert the violin in between those beats. So instead of ba 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 like that, you're going ba 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 ba, and it feels faster. That probably was faster because I'm a talentless hack, but I mean, you're just putting the things in between the other things. Therefore, the actual pace of the track doesn't really increase, but by increasing its density on separate notes or beats, you make it feel like it's going faster. And yet, by doing that with a part of the music that has already been established, a motif or a riff that we're already familiar with, It doesn't feel like the music is doing more things we have to mentally keep up with. And I think that when you listen to these on their own, they can feel a touch thin in a way they don't when they're in a game. There's a subtle but important difference in my mind to the casual listener between a normal piece of music and a good piece of video game soundtrack. There's a certain change in information density that I feel like is key, that is very difficult to put to words, for me anyway. But I think that good video game soundtracks do this thing. And I can just see how, for a crunchy game where you're going to be looking through your options and choosing what you're going to hit the boss with, having played a little bit of Chrono Arc myself, I feel like this is a great piece of boss music. It has just the right amount of kind of space, but there's enough going on to increase the intensity as well. And I think part of how it does that is by reusing these motifs and instruments and then increasing the track's intensity mostly by syncopating existing pieces of music rather than by making the music go somewhere else. There's no need. You've set the vibe. We could just roll with it. That's fine. And it's neat how songs having their own natural lulls and intensity phases, intensifications, lulls and intensifications, creates this kind of narrative for the player. I can think of many times in the music where, when I've been playing games, where I listened to the soundtrack, and at a point where it was a little bit low or less energetic, I recalled how I'm a little worried about how I'm doing in this particular combat encounter. And moments where it got intense, you feel like, let's kick some ass. You know, it gets you a little bit pumped to get in there and do some big damage or whatever. And I think that that's just really fun. That's just one of the simple pleasures of playing video games, is how that kind of creates its own story. A little thing toward the end of the parlay that EyePatchNotes wanted to conclude with: Stronghold Land Eater's lyrics, such as they are not entirely original. They're sampled from, disclaimer for inaccuracies, you think Back to You by Zek, where the lyrics are played more straightforwardly. Again, I've put all these in the description if you want to listen to them. There's a subsection of YouTube humor that employs sentence mixing, liberal splicing of existing speech to construct new out-of-context sentences. And I would argue that reuse of canonical context is, in fact, buildcraft. Having a finite library of syllables and phonemes, I've somehow never heard that before, is similar to a game hosting only so many build combinations. While it's possible to fake a sound or word by overlapping individual pieces, the creator will eventually have to make compromises. Less so the case with this track, but I'm still musically and intellectually stimulated by Stronghold Land Eater. They took the canonical phrase from Back to You, spliced it in piecemeal, and the listener can reconstruct the canonical phrase despite it never actually appearing in the track. That is, you can put together that this is sort of the whole message, even though uninterrupted, it never appears in sequence as such. At least not as far as I heard. Anyway, yeah, I think it's an interesting thought. The idea that you're sort of using the pieces that were there to remake some new thing is an interesting part of internet culture as a whole. The idea of fair use and remixing things is something I have a little bit of a prickle in my pocket about with parlay like this, because I think it should be reasonable for me to just use small chunks of the song for like 3 seconds to show you a thing, but alas. And this is done a lot in media. I personally feel like, being a creator on the internet, it's one of the hardest things. You know, streaming a game or a piece of music, there's the pitfall that even if you license your piece of music for a game, it can sometimes get flagged when people stream it, and so having the music be truly original and thus kind of opening its license so that people streaming the piece of media don't get caught is an important staple of video game production. There are other routes, but topic for another time. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I sometimes feel like when songs have referenced another song, I don't know. I have a bias against this, and I'm wondering if there's really a point in trying to unpack that in this parlay. But what you're saying interests me a lot. The idea that you kind of have a library of pieces to work with, and you reorganize them in a certain way, or the idea that there would be a sort of cousin song to this other song that uses its primary focused lyrics in a really new way that isn't the way that that song originally did. It's pretty cool when you hear a sample in a piece of dubstep or something that you recognize from somewhere and think, Oh, how neat. Like what a weird different context for that to be used in, something like that. I love that kind of thing. I'm not saying I think it's bad when people reuse things or whatever. There's just a way of sometimes it does make me ask why in situations like this. You know, I can't help but be focused on, but why is that from this other song? I don't know. I don't know why I'm overly attached to that. But I guess it's our way of creating meaning. Like when looking for where the song is coming from, it's tempting to latch on to pieces of information like this. I often find I am caught when I appreciate a piece of art between enjoying it in and of itself on its own merits and enjoying the story around it, which I find is often interesting in and of itself, but actually detracts from the piece of art in my experience. It makes my enjoyment much more about the story and much less about the piece. And it then comes the question, which I prefer more if they're both good, etc. And that's a bit outside the scope of this parlay, but it's just something that came to mind as we're talking about pieces of music, because I think as very layered, but with a lot of, you know, individual moving parts kind of pieces, a piece of music is different from something like a painting in my mind, where you may look at the thing and have it impact you, you know, all at once, and there it was. Whereas a piece of music, you may focus on different parts of the music at different times. I guess that's similar to a painting that you might look through and see, you know, a certain thing in the background or the foreground or a different part of the painting. But I think it's different. I think that it often, a piece of music, kind of like the difference between a beverage and a food item, changes context more easily. You listen to it in the car and it feels different. You listen to it in a game and it feels different. Whereas you may have trouble penetrating that painting at all unless you give it your full attention. I guess that's what I'm getting at. This might seem like an unorganized mess, which means I'm pushing myself to talk about something I'm not sure I have a fully formed thought about. But it makes me interested, EyePatchNotes, because I feel like your way of looking at the pieces of music in their layers is something I believe is somewhat distinct to music, and it gets at the sort of core of the artistry of a piece of music to me, that you can kind of dig into its moving parts a little bit. And to me, in some way, that clashes with the idea that it has this other context. It doesn't mean that's bad or wrong, but I view them as a little bit separate. I guess another way I would put it is, why have these other attachments to these other pieces of media when the piece of music is so intricately crafted in and of itself? It just seems like those two things would motivate different kinds of people, and yet the music was made by the same person. I've always found that fascinating, troubling, ontologically stimulating. That's the end of the parlay. I just wanted to share that in some way and see what, and also to say that I've enjoyed these music parlay, almost in spite of myself. I thought at first I really wouldn't, but it is enjoyable the way that fun literary interpretation can be, where you dig a little bit in and think about what you could be doing with those moving parts. It was fun. Thank you for the parlay. I'm looking forward to the next one. Folks, if you want to submit a parlay like this, you can do that using a link in the description. You can see how to do that, or just keep listening to these for free. EyePatchNotes, I'm looking forward to the next one.